right, well, I still see a few attendees joining, but I'm just going to kick things off and welcome everyone to the Emerging Market Investors Alliance Extractive Industries Program webinar series. And my name is Andrew Howell. I'm the Corporate Research Director here at the Emerging Market Investors Alliance. And for those of you joining us for the first time, the Alliance is a nonprofit. We bring together investors, companies, governments, and policy experts on sustainability, ESG issues in emerging markets. We looking to educate investors on ESG and also promote engagement, advocate for best practice among the governments and companies they invest in. Now, we have several programs here at the Alliance, and the Extractive Industries program that I run has been involved in a wide range of issues, from payments transparency, tailings management, community engagement, and others. But this topic today, so modern slavery, the nebulous of human rights abuses that are associated with that, is one of the really important issues for us. And I'm really thrilled to welcome quite an illustrious panel here to discuss this topic this morning. You see us all here before you. Now, for starters, we have Professor Remy Piet, who's an advisor for the Alliance and a very regular collaborator with us. He'll be leading this discussion. Now, before I hand things over to Remy, I want to introduce the other speakers here. We have 4 of them from 2 organizations. Firstly, PACT. So PACT is an international NGO working to help the world's poorest. They've been around 50 years and work in about 40 countries. This group looks at mining issues, among other topics. And they have a focus within mining on artisanal and small-scale miners across Africa and Asia. So that's, of course, very relevant to the topic of today. From PACT, we have Dan Jarman, who's the Executive Director of PACT UK, has 20 years experience in international development, particularly looking at fragile states. And Amayele is PACT's DRC Child Labor and Mining Reporting Coordinator. So they both, I think, will have a lot of insights into this topic. Now, the other organization today is Global Rights Compliance, or GRC. This is an international law firm and consultancy that works with business, governments, NGOs across the world on business and human rights issues. Now, from GRC, we've got Wayne Jordash, who's GRC's managing partner and is a leading Queen's Counsel, one of the highest ranking lawyers in the UK. Wayne regularly advises businesses and governments on human rights issues. And he's joined by Michele, who's the head of strategy for GRC with 20 years of experience of her own as a human rights lawyer and diplomat, including in many conflict zones. So I think it goes without saying it's an impressive group here. And without further ado, I want to hand things over to Remy. But a final point to make is that if you have questions, as always, feel free to ask those into the Q&A box. We'll try to ask those later on in the discussion. And I will now then hand things over to Remy.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And first of all, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for our co-panelists and friends for being with us for this very important topic. As Andrew mentioned, we have this series of webinars on a monthly basis on different issues. Some of people attending might have been to the last one on community consent and prior consultation for extractive sector. Today, we're talking about, as Andrew was mentioning, modern slavery, and we'll have issues on local content in these communities in the future. But I think this topic here is absolutely essential. It looks at a series of regulatory rules that investors and extractive industries must be aware of. Some of them are already very well aware of, some others are lagging a bit behind. And it fits into this entire narrative of trying to and actual process of trying to clean up and get some very transparent supply chains for the extractive sector. So the issue of modern slavery, following the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, is essential in there in terms of quality of workforce and quality of processes for the mineral process line and supply chains. At Embellie Advisory, my company, where we actually work on above the ground risk mitigation and community relations, this is one of the key issues, and I'm very extremely proud to have GRC and PACT. We've done a series of events with PACT in the past already, and GRC is the first one, definitely not the last one, to discuss on those issues of modern slavery. Without further ado, I'll turn to probably Michele from GRC. You're based in the UK, Michele. The UK has been a pioneer on those questions with the, as I said, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. There's another, legal framework in France, in the EU in general. The US is a little bit more lagging behind on this. Could you maybe start by introducing and give us the regulatory framework and the situation, such as you've been experiencing and you've been working on for the last few years on those issues.
Great. Well, thank you, Remy, and thanks, Andrew, for the introduction. It's great to be here with PAC today. This is a wonderful opportunity. So let me kind of sort of do an introductory piece on that, and Wayne will pick up a bit more later on some of the pieces of legislation. So from the outset, I'd say it's important to make clear that slavery is, as Andrew was saying, this is an apex. We consider it an apex chains or anywhere in supply chains. You need to consider broad human rights due diligence issues, not just modern slavery. Now, the reason you can't just focus on modern slavery is that the increasing depth and complexity of mandatory BHR legislation uses the wider term human rights to encompass slavery and those wider issues. So the companies you're investing in or with need to think not only about modern slavery, but about all human rights they might be infringing, and as such, so do you. Importantly, you can help them do better through the leverage you can exert through your investment or your business relationship. Now, here's a bit of a flavor of the law. So the French duty of vigilance legislature is a good example of the sharp end of where due diligence law seems to be heading. It'll only be applicable for American investors. For example, if you invest in a smelter company owned by a French extractive firm. Now, under this law, big French parent companies need to identify and prevent all adverse human rights and environmental impacts, including modern slavery, resulting from their own activities, or of those that they control, the subcontractors and suppliers. So as an investor, you need to make sure this is happening. Another example is the EU Directive on Human Rights Due Diligence, which Remy flagged, being negotiated at the moment. Now, at a minimum, it's likely to oblige US firms bound by the law, so where you are trading in Europe, to map and analyze your supply chains, report publicly on social and environmental risks, and provide evidence of strategies to mitigate these risks. This means that US extractives, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, finance, and apparel brands operating in Europe may be held accountable for failure to prevent serious harm occurring in the value chain. Now, particularly significant, I think, for today's purpose is the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation, which entered into force on January 1st, 2021. Now, inspired by US legislation, it aims to ensure responsible sourcing for tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, which are commonly sourced from high-risk and conflict areas, by requiring a number of actors, including mining companies, raw material traders, smelters, refiners, and those dealing in metal stage products, to certify that upon importing to the EU that their minerals are sourced responsibly and do not contribute to conflict or other illegal activities generally defined. Good legal terms there. Now, there's also a plethora, as we're sort of saying, of recent legislation targeted specifically at modern slavery. The California Transparency Act, that was first. And then here in the UK, we had the Modern Slavery Act, or quite a tapestry of laws in these areas. Now, alongside this legislative provisions, which we call hard law, there's a myriad of what we call soft law, frameworks and benchmarks. So non-binding instruments, pressuring business to address modern slavery and human rights. Now, for a bit of this, they include the UN Principles on Responsible Investment, the Aviva Human Rights Benchmark, and chief among them is, this one will be familiar, the OECD Due Diligence Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and then the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, which really, that one represents the most universalized global standard expected conduct by which businesses are expected to respect all human rights by preventing, mitigating, and or remediating violations of those rights. So stopping here, but in conclusion, what does all this legislation mean for you? Firstly, and this is kind of how we talk to our clients, you simply need to address human rights and modern slavery risks in the business you invest in. While there used to be no legal compulsion for companies to think about broader human rights issues, of which, as already said, slavery is an apex crime, this was instead the domain of governments, where I used to work in foreign service and aid organizations. But business did not need to be responsible. Now, that's just totally changed. Second, based on the speed with which the laws in this area have evolved and our understanding in GRC that it's the intention of regulators to make them ever more punitive if progress on human rights and modern slavery is not made, we in GRC advise our companies, we really do this, to address human rights and modern slavery risk with some urgency. And attending webinars like this is a great step. So third, while the law is complex, it needn't be feared, and we definitely stress this to our clients. taking a crossing your T's and dotting your I's approach, microscopically determining which provisions and which acts you might be caught by, is necessary homework. But once that stage is complete, we strongly advise that it's not about taking a compliance approach, but instead it's a leadership one, and implementing a human rights due diligence plan and exerting leverage in your supply chain or in the businesses you invest in, even at that one board meeting a year you might attend, to try and affect change. We say this because, again, we know through experience that what the legislator is truly looking for, whichever bit of legislation it is that you're stepping up, you're taking responsibility, you're changing your own behavior, not just complying for compliance sake. What we help our clients to do, and it's my very last point, Remy, is exactly that. We make the law simple, and we help our clients respond in the way we know will meet both the regulators' expectations of your business and does right by human rights. So thank you very much.
Michele, I always enjoy listening to you. So I'm always sad that you're almost done. I'll turn back to you with the future questions. Let me make sure that they continue on this. I think what's essential when you mention this difference between compliance, leadership, one element also which is essential to understand is the potential impact that it has on the reputation of a company, on investor, if those key processes on compliance on human rights, compliance on workers' rights, on modern slavery are not followed. So it's not only a due diligence, double checking that your operations are actually up to par. It's also, using that opportunity to, ensure that you do not have the terrible costs that we've seen a series of institutional investors having to face because of a lack of overseeing and a lack of completing and making sure that, the basic elements of modern slavery or quality of workforce processes are put in place. In that element, since we're talking specifically about the extractive sector, I thought it would be very interesting to maybe turn to Dan and Pact. We had the pleasure to work with Pact on a series of projects of formalization, or knowing what they're doing in different countries, especially in Africa or in Southeast Asia, and more in Colombia, also as countries in Latin America. Dan, can I turn to you and maybe ask you what is today the situation in terms of working conditions, of those issues of modern slavery that the British legal framework is really increasing scrutiny on, especially maybe in the artisanal and small scale mining elements, but maybe also from your perspective from larger industrial miners, if you want to bring some elements to that answer.
Thanks, Remy. Well, hopefully you enjoy listening to me as much as you enjoy listening to Michele. If not, I'm sorry to disappoint you. So I think one thing that's first, just to frame this, is to talk about what we mean when we say artisanal and small scale mining. There's no universal definition, but in the Pact world, we basically refer to low tech, labor intensive mineral extraction and processing. And what's important about this is it's often illegal. It's almost always informal. And while it can appear chaotic, it's usually well organized. ASM can range from quite well formed cooperatives right the way to a chap literally digging a hole with his bare hands. And I think also is trying to understand, why does Pact focus on ASM? Well, not only because it tends to impact on some of the world's most marginalized and poorest people, but actually this is a really significant, this is a big global issue, and how big is it? I think all of us hear about things like child labor, we hear about conflict, blood minerals, blood diamonds, those kind of things. So recently, in a collaboration with the World Bank on a project called Delve, we actually tried to take a kind of global, just to try to understand the actual situation of ASM globally with sort of robust data, which has never been tried before. And I think the results are staggering. Our estimate is there are at least 42 million people over 80 countries worldwide who are, working in ASM directly, okay, with a further 120 to maybe 250 million who are working in ancillary services that are supported by this. Their livelihoods are supported by that mining. If you then think about household sizes of families that are supported by ASM, we're actually talking vast numbers of people. And this covers construction materials, mica that goes into cosmetics. We're talking about consumer electronics, and indeed all the minerals that are required for the renewable energy revolution. Right, this is it's in everything. ASM is touching everything. And of the global workforce of mining, 90% are actually in artisanal small scale mining. So that gives you an illustration. And then I think the contribution of ASM is the next important thing to really understand. 20 to 30% of the world's gold is produced by ASM, 20% of diamonds, 80 to 90% of colored gemstones, 25% of tantalum, you know, goes into your mobile phones and laptops. So a huge amount is being produced by this vast number of workers. And I think what's really important for us all to understand is not only is regulation in modern slavery going to become more intensive, but so is the opportunity for modern slavery, right? The World Bank has estimated enormous increases in the use of minerals like lithium and cobalt, which rely very heavily on ASM. You know, we're talking about 500% increases over like 20, 30 years. And the opportunity for modern slavery in those supply chains is not going to be going away. It's going to be getting any bigger. And how does modern slavery fit into artisanal small-scale mining? Well, there are a number of factors, Richly, which are kind of not necessarily inescapable and certainly not something we can't confront, but they are sort of endemic, I think, when you look at that. So we look at poor labour standards. We tend to be in remote locations, sometimes conflict affected. The states where it happens characterised by human rights abuses. Law is weak or unenforceable. As I said, ASM is often an illegal activity. You know, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people potentially operating illegally. You know, child labour occurs. There are sort of poverty cycle reasons for that as well, right? So without regulation and without formalisation, obviously people are open to exploitation. And while the issues vary from country to country and mineral to mineral, right? What you do with gold, which you can carry in your hand, is different to cobalt, which fits in a sack. You know, we do see the same kind of things coming up, just they vary in sort of size and shape. And I think what's important to us is, you know, yes, the sector is huge. Yes, it is growing. It's becoming ever more important because of the location of the sorts of minerals that are required for the move that our global economy is moving into, right? This is not a problem that's going to go away. We have, you know, companies who are, for example, looking at diversifying away from one mineral to another because there's been publicity on one mineral. Well, the other mineral is going to be extracted in just the same way. And I think while we think of ASM as being kind of very mom and pop, you know, very, very informal, very disorganized, it isn't. And it forms a really fundamental part of the base of the pyramid of our global supply chains. You know, and not only is there a sort of a poverty, you know, rights issue, which PACT, of course, as a non-profit is really interested in, but this goes much beyond that. A lot of the resources that are exploited from these, you know, people who are, you know, held in bonded labor or whatever that might be, you know, that the proceeds of that are going into organized crime. They're funding terrorism, right? These are things that expand their reach far beyond the deserts and jungles of where we work. And I think just talking about that point on large-scale mining, you know, a lot of the mines that operate on legal concessions, large-scale mining, you know, they have a kind of a, you know, they're zero-sum game where, you know, productivity is, you know, if it doesn't reach a certain level, obviously the mine is not viable. What we're finding now is that more and more mines are going to rely more heavily on the sort of labour that ASM brings, right? Because it's more viable in the long term. To make those mines productive, engagement with ASM is going to become more important. Indeed, our entire programme actually grew out of 20 years ago, a large-scale mine saying, how do we cope with these illegal ASM sort of scratching around the edge? They're not necessarily sort of stealing our wealth, if you like. They're not taking the money because we would never have extracted that, but they are having an environmental impact, which we are responsible for. You know, the things that happen to them on our concession are our responsibility. How do we manage that? So anyhow, I'll leave that there, but I think it's important to just set the stage because ASM is so massive, and because of the factors where ASM is generated, modern slavery is absolutely ripe for proliferation there.
No, thank you, Dan, and that was very complete. You're actually neck and neck with Michele. I mean, I'm going to turn to Wayne to break the tie on this one, but just to continue setting the stage, it might be a little, you know, surprising from the perspective of American investors that we actually focus so much on issues of modern slavery. It's very clear in terms of, you know, if you're a UK based or a French based or usually a European organization, that this has become something of their daily life to make sure that the due diligence is right in place and they actually answer to the new regulations in terms of modern slavery and quality of workforce. The issue that Dan mentioned, which is especially the cracking down also on financing on criminal organization through ASM. I was talking with the US Embassy in Peru, for example, yesterday, and that's going to be one of their main focus to make sure that the, you know, the use of informal gold mining, for example, to finance a series of criminal organizations is being tackled, and that will intensify even more the scrutiny on those issues, especially with the upcoming Biden administration. The question then for Wayne is really in terms of the perspective from the investors. To which level are investors responsible for the behavior of the company in which they invest in? What is the level of responsibility? Can you maybe give us from your perspective, Wayne, how do you believe that from the perspective of an investor, what should be the right processes in place and the key objective to tackle to make sure that they actually get to the level of their obligation and don't discover bad surprises in a few years?
Okay, thank you, Remy. I'll address that question in the following way. I mean, first of all, to acknowledge it's difficult to answer this in the abstract. It will, of course, depend upon many different factors, which depend upon the nature of the business, the precise jurisdiction where the work is taking place, the legislative framework that is applicable directly. Michele and Dan have already made the point, I think, very eloquently of the concerning the complexity of the law and the practice and the obligations in this area. And as I say, they depend upon these varying factors to some degree, which vary across the international sphere, the regional sphere, the domestic sphere, and so on. Law, as Michele said, can be formal. That means specifically that it concerns more directly criminal or civil responsibility. For example, the California Transparency Act. Or it can be informal, meaning that although it still encapsulates international legal obligations, it perhaps has not been built into such specific national or regional formal law. So the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is undoubtedly the signature law in this sphere, may not in a particular jurisdiction have been translated into domestic law, but nonetheless, by adhering to its demands, an investment firm may stay on the right side of the law and may, as a result, protect their investment from human rights risks, litigation, and reputational damage. Two particular legal frameworks are relevant, or there are many, and I think, as Michele said, they're proliferating around the world as the world moves to a much more regulatory type environment for business and investment companies. But two notable ones at the moment: the UK Modern Slavery Act of 2015 and the French Duty of Vigilance Law. These are good to hone in for a moment, because they are reflective of the overall legal and regulatory environment which investment companies find themselves. So firstly, the UK Modern Slavery Act. Under Section 54 of the Act, investment companies, corporations of a certain size, have an obligation to report the existence of and steps taken to mitigate modern slavery risks. It applies to the entire supply chain of businesses with an annual turnover of 36 per year. Given the high-risk nature of the extractive industry, compliance with these reporting obligations would require investors in this area to conduct supply chain mapping. This refers to the procedure by which businesses identify the material sources, processes, and shipments involved in bringing goods to the market, and also the process of understanding the risks in those chains and relationships. Supply chain mapping usually begins with those whom you are directly contracting, known as Tier 1 enterprises. But risks often, as you will appreciate, exist further down the supply chain, where the company, the investment individuals or organizations have less insight and less chance of immediately recognizing and regulating the working practices. Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act may require an obligation to not only be satisfied of the Tier 1 enterprises' awareness and proactive mitigation of modern slavery risks, but also do the same in relation to several tiers down the supply chain, including contractors, subcontractors, and even to the source of the goods or materials in question. That's, in a sense, one of the softer areas of formal law. Moving now to, as Michele termed it, the sharper end, the French duty of vigilance law. This is a demanding piece of legislation which requires the largest French parent companies to establish, publish, and implement vigilance plans to identify and prevent adverse human rights impacts, including modern slavery. In brief, it applies to the parent company, it applies to companies it controls directly or indirectly, and it also applies to the subcontractors and suppliers with whom it maintains an established business relationship. So, as you can see, immediately, it is demanding, and it requires work, and it requires insight, and it requires proactiveness. Now, these two examples are by no means exhaustive, and the difficulty I have, and anyone has, in answering the question of how far do obligations go for investors is reflective of the difficulty you will face as investors. No two investments will be the same, and the most applicable law may vary, meaning that your obligations may, and I say only may, change according to your operational context. Now this, of course, sounds like there's a great deal of uncertainty regarding the precise extent of the business and human rights obligations. But we can cut through this complexity to a certain extent. And we at GRC advise our investor clients to understand that as investors, your responsibility remains to prevent, mitigate, and remedy human rights harms wherever they are linked, wherever you are linked to those harms through your supply chain or investees. How do you do this? How do you cut through this complexity and make sure that the processes you engage in will meet the demands of this varying legal landscape? Well, 4 principal steps. 1, due diligence policies. 2, identifying adverse impacts. 3, remediating, that is, acting on your findings from 1 and 2. And 4, monitoring and evaluating. Now, there's not much time to go into the detail of these, but these 4 steps, proactive, dynamic steps, provide the feedback loop to improve your risk management and for reporting, which will meet the various legal requirements contained in the plethora of formal and informal law. Due diligence policy is it's a risk-based approach to identifying and prioritizing those areas which pose the most significant risk of adverse human rights impacts in your activities and in your supply chain. Number 2, identifying adverse impacts, initially through desk-based research and later through meaningful stakeholder engagement within affected communities. This is the kind of expertise that PACT and GRC specialize in. And finally, 3, remediating, acting on your findings. You need to manage the risks where you're able to do so, or in the most extreme cases, and I emphasize this, in your most extreme cases, divesting the business relationship when you're not able to manage the risks. So 4, monitoring and evaluating, and this is critical. It's the loop. It's where a business learns. It's where a business doesn't have to go back to the starting point each time. It's identifying the problems and following up and tracking engagement, including effective communication with the various stakeholders. And it's only by doing that, by creating this feedback loop, ensuring that you ensure that your engagement and due diligence practices remain effective, remain efficient, and importantly for business, remains efficient and likely to be less time consuming. So in conclusion, I apologize if I'm not able to answer the question specifically, in the sense that there is no model that fits all. But by making a commitment to meaningful due diligence through the processes I've outlined, incorporating the principles that I've outlined, what you will end up doing is having a much more holistic familiarity with the risks in your own supply chains, the risks in your investments, and as such, you will arrive at a place where you are capable of complying with a range of legal frameworks, regardless of the precise nature of those obligations. So to answer the question as directly as I can, the linear extent of your obligations in your supply chain is not the right focus. The focus should be, where are the risks most likely to exist, and what are you doing to identify and mitigate those risks? Thank you.
No, thank you, Wayne. And I think what's very interesting to complement your intervention is to try to get it from the other perspective, which is, you know, from the ground up, from the operation. And my next question will be for Amayele, specifically on, you know, a work in Congo and the work of PACT in different projects. I also use the opportunity first to just remind everyone that we do use the QAA on chat. So I've seen a great question from Patrick. I think there's an interest in Mozambique specifically, so I'll answer to Patrick privately on Mozambique, but Michele already answered to it on the role of consumers versus investors there. But please feel free to ask any question. We'll just, you know, take them along and be very reactive to be able to provide you answers to your specific interest into this webinar. Turning to Amayele, and thank you again, Mayele, for being with us. You do have extensive experience on you know, monitoring you know, modern slavery, human rights conditions on different mining sites, especially in Congo. Could you maybe share with us that expertise, and what are especially the best practices that companies could replicate, or that investors could actually monitor to make sure that the companies in which they're invested are implementing the right protocols?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Remy. I think, first of all, to set a bit of the stage, I would say that, you know, as Dan pointed out, there are several forms of modern slavery and human rights abuses at ASM sites around the world. In the DRC, we recently undertook further desk and field research on modern slavery in the DRC and UK supply chain. And we saw that, our literature review, showed that there was about more than 1 million people in the DRC in modern slavery, including over 40,000 children working in mining activities in southern DRC in the cobalt supply chain. We then undertook surveys, interviews, training workshop with mining stakeholders in the DRC, and it showed the existence of physical violence, sexual exploitation, debt bondage, child labor, poor working condition, and labor standards that mining community wanted to address and to improve. So although this picture might seem a bit bleak, there are things that can be done, and ways in which investors and companies could engage to change the situation and turn the risk pose by working with ASM workers into market opportunities. So I'm going to give you a concrete example here. In 2017, we were contacted by Trafigura, a commodity trading and logistics company, who had signed an offtake agreement with Shemaf, a mining company, for cobalt hydroxide. Some of the cobalt produced by Shemaf was mined at Mutoshi site in Kolwezi, southern DRC. And Shemaf has initially planned to fully mechanize this site. However, there were some ASM workers coming from surrounding communities that were on this site. It was about 5,000 of them. They got organized into a cooperative called Komiakol, which then became the single authorized ASM contractor operating on a designed area of the Mutoshi concession, known as Mutoshi Cobalt. In 2018, we started a responsible sourcing project with Trafigura, Shemaf, so the mining company, Komiakol, the cooperative, the relevant government agencies, as well as Kumi Consulting, which is a third party that was in charge of monitoring the results of the project. The main objective of the project was to ensure that the minerals sold by Komiakol to Shemaf were sourced in accordance with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chain of mineral from conflict-affected area and high-risk area, as well as Trafigura's responsible sourcing ASM expectation. In this project, we as PAC served as both coordinator and capacity development partner in charge of establishing responsible sourcing standards and building the capacity of on-site suppliers, workers, and stakeholders to maintain such standards. So more concretely, we basically help Trafigura and Shemaf identify the risks that were taking place on site and also during the transportation of minerals to the processing entity, and identify solutions to mitigate those risks. So what kind of risks did we identify? The first set of risks was regarding working conditions, labor standards, and OHS, occupational health and safety, on site. So the solutions that we implemented, including the free provision of personal protective equipment to Comiacol workers, the provision of a mechanized assistance in the preparation and cleaning of the site by removing the overburden. We made sure that no pits dug were more than 10 meters deep, and we did not allow to dig any tunnels horizontally. And we also ensured the provision of sanitary facilities, healthcare, water, and more to Mitoshi Cobalt. The second set of risks that we identified was pertaining to child labor and illegal miners entering the site. The solutions that we implemented comprised ensuring that there was only one single entrance to the Mitoshi Cobalt site, and we also put an electrical fence around the perimeter. We also issued ID cards to Comiacol workers and made sure that no one could enter the site unless they were able to show those ID cards and unless they were wearing PPEs on site. In addition, at the community level, we at PACT also implemented a certain number of activities to further decrease the risk of child labor. Those included raising awareness on the worst form of child labor, children's rights, as well as positive parenting techniques in the community, and that was really to change social norms around child labor. A second thing that we did was to work with vulnerable families to ensure their economic empowerment so they could access small loans and start income generating activities. Another thing that we did as well was implementing an apprenticeship program in alternative trades to mining for young miners aged 15 to 17 years old, because our research has showed that they are some of the most dependent on income from mining. So all of these activities are low cost but high impact, and they can form the basis with which to start to more actively engage in addressing issues in the sector. SHEMAF, SAIMAP, which is the DRC state regulator for ASM, Comiacol, which is the mining cooperative, and PACT also conducted regular inspections on site and reported all of the incidents which were identified during a defined time period. After about a year and a half of implementation, we commissioned a report from 3 economic development specialists, which showed the following social and economic impacts at the local level. First of all, significantly improving working conditions and health of the workers thanks to the free accessible healthcare services. A second thing that was identified was a marketed positive impact on the local economy, including the creation of new businesses in response to increased new demand for goods and services. The study also showed that for every 1,000 miners at the site, the local economic impact was approximately $1 million per year. And finally, female miners who participated in the project earned 2.5 more than their counterparts that were working outside of the project zone. So basically, through this integrated holistic approach, the project was able to put in place due diligence processes to align with national laws and international regulations, including the ILO Convention and OECD guidance. The project was also able to address OHS risks to reduce accidents and improve productivity, to increase income and reduce the dependence on child labor. We were also able to implement a certain number of controls to prevent underage access on site. We also built the capacity of key actors to address the risk of child labor and other human rights risks taking place on site. There was also a very positive economic benefits, the SHEMAF and Trafigura, which included the social license to operate in the community, access to cobalt mine in areas that were deemed not economically suitable for large-scale mechanization, as well as reduced security risks. So basically, for me anyways, this example really shows that companies should not use their membership in or the existence of multi-stakeholder initiatives as an excuse not to do anything. They are responsible for their own due diligence, and they can use international regulations to identify and address modern slavery as well as other human rights abuses in their mineral supply chain. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Amayele. That was interesting. That's a very good case study in Congo. Obviously, I mean, each mining operation or energy operation for the extractive sector has its particularities. I mean, but the case of Congo is interesting. We have experience in Latin America or in Africa. If any question is on those countries, we're happy to tackle them specifically. I know there's a question from Pierre. Bonjour, Pierre. I'm happy to see that you're on this webinar regarding how is it possible to track down where the products are going for a mining company, and actually do we tackle also the question of commodities end of use? Andrew, do you want to tackle this specifically and maybe discuss after on the issue of courtization of human rights and how that fits into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe just to start, before we get to Pierre's question, I would like to ask, and by the way, Michele, Wayne, and Dan, you can go ahead and turn on your cameras, and Amayele as well, since we'll just kind of switch into a broader discussion now, since all of you have presented, and thank you all for just fascinating comments. Maybe to understand a little bit the scope of the problem of modern slavery and the related human rights abuses, I think, it's clear from some of your remarks that this is more associated with the artisanal and small scale mining than large scale corporate mining. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that question, maybe starting with Dan. When you look at the bigger mining corporations, the types that some folks on this call would be investing in directly, how much of this issue is their problem as well? Do you find abuses in the Glencores and BHPs of the world, or AngloGold Ashanti? Is this something which that they can also be implicated in these types of coerced labor, child labor, etc.? Or even if it's not they themselves that are doing it, as you say, you have on the fringes the artisanal miners that are involved in this, and there is a kind of sometimes symbiotic relationship that maybe exists with the big company and the ASMs who are involved in these transgressions. And so then the question becomes, what more steps can they be taking to avoid and to prevent this? Do they have power to help solve this problem? And what can investors do to encourage them to play that role in problem solving on the fringes? Maybe just to you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks. So it's a big question. Certainly there is risk for large scale mining companies as well. I mean, you Google any of them and you'll see lots of issues around human rights abuses and things coming up. I think part of the issue now is not only that those aren't going away, perhaps are increasing, but actually, of course, they're much more visible than perhaps they have ever been before, right? So more people are interested in it, more people are concerned about it, more people are raising alarms about it. And I think it's becoming harder and harder for firms to say, well, our concession ends here, and therefore so does our responsibility for any sort of implication or linkage to any form of modern slavery, right? That may happen as part of the supply chain, or who's supplying the food that your workers are eating. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem within which they sit within, and I think at the moment, looking at compliance, let's face it, all of these companies have been going to the compliance level right up until quite recently. I mean, we work with Apple, for example, in removing child labor from the supply chain of cobalt for them. Now, they only came to us 3 or 4 years ago to start looking at that. So even firms where we think, have really high ethical values and whatnot, that, they've only just started saying, actually, we really need to be we need to be on top of this, because we think this is something that could, well, not only is morally reprehensible and we should be stopping, but could blow up on us both reputationally and, you know, potentially as an existential threat for our businesses. So, you know, I think yes is the very short answer to that. There's huge exposure to risk there for large scale firms and companies that, you know, along the supply chain. Can anything be done about it? Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. So under the Dodd-Frank Act, obviously there was, you know, there's been a lot of moving to ensure that, you know, minerals, so 3 Ts and gold in the Great Lakes region are, you know, certified conflict free. As a result, so PACT has a program funded by industry, which is all based on levies at the smelter level, managed and implemented by host governments in line with international law and their own legal, you know, their own legal frameworks, which are not often enforced per se. And then PACT as the certifying agent. You know, we're able to get several $100 million of minerals onto the international market that otherwise would not be getting onto the international market because of the exposure to risk at that level. And some of that mineral is artisanal and some of it is not. I mean, the majority is. So, you know, there's certainly a lot that can be done about it. I think as well for firms, you know, I've heard firms talking about, well, you know, cobalt's riddled with child labor. We should go and find a new mineral and develop a new battery technology, right, to avoid cobalt and child labor. I can assure you that a certification program, such as the sort that PACT runs in the Great Lakes region, is significantly cheaper than developing those sorts of technologies. But I think this, again, it's about going beyond compliance, right? It's not saying, is this enough to make sure that we're not, you know, going to be hauled through the courts? It's actually say, how do we turn our business? And I actually believe that businesses can make more money by tackling some of these issues. You know, there's a great load of PR and stuff that can be generated on top of that. You know, how can we turn our business actually to be a force that, you know, actively counters these things? And, you know, sure, we'll get out of mining, it may well go to somewhere else. But if we don't think these issues are existing in agribusiness or in textiles or in, you know, in construction, I mean, then we're fooling ourselves, right? But certainly in mining, we know that there are ways of dealing with this, and we know there are problems that exist across the supply chain, and not just in the mineral supply chain, but those who are supplying, you know, services to large-scale mines, small and artisanal alike.
Thanks, Dan. Maybe to Wayne and Michele, just on that question, if you have a comment, but also I wanted to follow up on Michelle's point about the different charters and kind of best practice guidelines that exist out there. Maybe the UN guiding principles on human rights would be the gold standard per se. Do you have recommendations for companies which you advise as to what are the best frameworks for them to use? I mean, you mentioned a few others as well. And is there kind of a best starting point for a company to kind of take on a set of standards to endorse, which would then give their investors confidence that they're have the right sort of frameworks to manage these risks?
Well, let me just perhaps sort of just move out to sort of very general principle, because I think, you know, the starting point is to, as I said during the presentation, to think about the management of risks, and alongside and I didn't mention this, but it's actually critical. Alongside the management of risk is, and at the core of the UN guiding principles, which I mentioned was the definitive framework, international framework, is the concept of leverage. And really leverage gets to the heart of what companies can realistically be expected to do in practice when faced with human rights challenges. And I think, you know, it's something to hold on to as a departure point, if you like, when it comes to the extractive industries, which you know, often comes with the types of complexities which we've been discussing. But and what does it mean? It means that we can, in a way, divide human rights risks into three types. Or rather, I should say it like this, that there's three types of ways in which a company can be involved in human rights adverse impacts. There can be one, that they cause those impacts themselves. The second, that they can contribute to them. And the third is that their operations are linked to them. And in relation to each of those three different ways, are attached different obligations in terms of leverage. So if a company causes directly causes the adverse impact, then they ought to use leverage to cease and prevent and remediate those harms. If alternatively they contribute to them, so that they're not the direct responsibility, if you like, of that operation, then they have the obligation to use leverage to cease, to have ceased those harms, to prevent those harms, and to use leverage to mitigate. And then you're then down to the third type, which is where the adverse human rights impact is more remote, but still linked to the company's or investment. So in these circumstances, there's still an obligation to use leverage to prevent those harms, and to try to take a forward looking approach and try to build leverage that perhaps doesn't exist but might exist with cooperating with others. So, for example, cooperating with other organizations, cooperating with civil society organizations, and so on, training processes, capacity building processes. That's the type of leverage that you might be able to develop when the harm is much more remote from the immediate activities under consideration. So to my mind, that's the starting point when we're looking how to focus in on harms which are caused by investments, is to sort of think in those terms, that there's always an obligation to leverage better conduct, but what's expected varies depending upon the remoteness of the harm to the immediate core operations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wayne. That's enlightening. I'd like maybe to go from there and turn to Dan and Michele and asking, what is it that GRC and PAT can propose in terms of helping investors or helping company, being more serious and more, let's say, moving forward on this issue of screening of modern slavery problems and mitigating the legal or regulatory risks that will arise if they don't follow the steps that they should. I just wanted to mention maybe one of the answers I did to Pierre from Responsible Money Foundation, the question that we're also receiving from the role of consumers in terms of pressuring investors, or the capacity from monitoring tools to not only look at modern slavery but also looking at the end use of different minerals, or looking at how along the entire line of supply chains there's real monitoring of the potential risk and impact on both on issues of sustainable development, basically. And so I brought in some answers, and my answer is really that we're inside a movement that is not going to slow down. We're seeing some key actors, even as I mentioned, the World Gold Council, which is not an NGO, but just really put in place the responsible gold mining principle. We're seeing more and more of the sustainable development goals mapping to the mining sector, to the energy sector. Some studies are being very interesting, being published lately, and so that's something that we're seeing. The question of modern slavery and working conditions as potentially one issue that has led the bloc, especially with the UK Act on this, but that will trickle down to a series of much more accountability and much more transparency, especially for actors that seek to be formal, that seek to be having a clear reputation and being able to show themselves as the leaders of the pack. So this is something, if you invested in mitigation on those risks, this is something that will reap benefits in the future, because this is a movement that is not going to stop. Maybe on this, I'm basically just opening the door for you, Michele, and then maybe Dan. What is the role that the GRC has there, and basically how can you also support investors or inform investors of what there is that main risks? And then the same question to Dan if you want to follow up after Michele.
I'm very grateful you asked me to go first, because my computer's been telling me that my Wi-Fi, my signal is not working. So I'll get this in and then I'll go to Wi-Fi when I finish. Okay. So thank you for that. So it's a great question. But basically, as this webinar has made clear, the matrix, I think, of human rights, hard and soft law at the international, we say this again, national and domestic level has expanded dramatically in the last even 10 years. It's complex, it's evolving, and we believe in GRC, and many, most people share this, and they do share this, that it's on a trajectory to become more punitive. And I would say much like the trajectory that the compliance area of bribery and corruption underwent. We in GRC, we clocked this expanding BHR agenda, some 10-ish, 15 years ago. And as a team of ex-diplomats, international human rights, humanitarian, criminal lawyers, with quite a deep understanding of how regulators work and of the international legal framework for human rights, we have a thorough understanding of all the obligations and responsibilities investors and companies have when it comes to human rights and modern slavery. And we don't work like other law firms because, as well as being lawyers, we're practical consultants. And we have a foundation as well. We have that, and we do development program as well. So we're quite a kind of a mixed bag, which I think is to our strength. So what do? We advise our clients on complex law and their liabilities, responsibilities. And in the end, let's be clear, I think an added edge we have is we provide legal advice and represent our clients whenever difficulties emerge or if things go wrong. And they might be sued, for example. At the same time, we double hat as practical consultants. We translate the law into strategies to change business practice so that when the rubber hits the road, you know exactly what you need to do and say to keep you on the right side of your obligations and responsibilities. Importantly, we don't sit in an ivory tower. Instead, we're business savvy, and we know how to do this in a way that not only upholds human rights, but is good for your business. And for investors like you, this might be as simple as advising you as to what you need to do and say when, say, as a non-controlling shareholder, you're preparing to attend the one board meeting a year of the company you've invested in. Or it might be walking alongside you as you consider investing in a company in a conflict zone where rights issues are prevalent and you need to understand the risks and how to go forward. In short, as lawyers, we make complex law simple. And then as consultants, we work with you to ensure you know what you need to do by right by human rights and modern slavery, and also in a way that's good for your business. We also work with all stakeholders, like PACT here today, who we greatly respect, or with governments on high-level policy in this area and on legislative reform. And we feel that our networks help us to provide you with cutting-edge advice, kind of a full-circle service. The very last thing I'd like to say, if I may, is that investors, regardless of all the legislation, you have a tremendous opportunity to positively influence the behavior of those companies you invest in, to do better to protect human rights and prevent modern slavery. It's real, as Amayele, and Dan are making clear. People are really suffering. In this webinar, these victims might feel far away. That idea, I like to say, I call it the corporatization of human rights. So even without the law influencing you as investors to take action, or indeed those of you who are watching who work in companies at the top ends of supply chains, I believe you have such important leverage due to your supply chain contracts or your investments to affect change in the companies you do business in or invest in, and as such in a very real way to improve the lives of millions at the ends of supply chains. And I'd say that in today's world of ever-growing popular demand, and one of the questions was about that, how do we change popular opinion for better business practice? Frankly, whether that be from our own children asking us questions when we come home from work about what do we do, or like me in COVID times when you open the door and you see them outside, all the questions you get from staff at work in our own businesses. I think that the leverage you have as investors and at the top of the supply chain, it's a great opportunity to affect real change when it comes to human rights, regardless of what the law says that you need to do. So that's where I would end and hand over to Dan. And I've still got my internet, which is good.
Maybe to transition to Dan, I just wanted to mention a few, and then answer on the question from Rachel asking, which kind of investors are leading the pack. There have been some clear changes over the last 2 or 3 years. I mentioned Société Générale as one investor that has felt the backlash of reputational impact of providing funds to companies that maybe did not have the best track record in terms of social work. We've seen BlackRock or Société Générale, as I said, include into their calculation of interest rate on their loan to different mining companies or energy companies a 5% margin that actually increases or decreases this is depending on the social performance of companies. So, this is just a start, obviously, and a lot of it is actually self-reported more than having, independent consultants looking at it. But that really shows a movement into the institutional investors community, into integrating issues of sustainability, of social goals, in terms of calculating how they support different investors. And then there are a few methodologies I'm happy to share by emails afterwards to be able to calculate this. Other companies that did not do this, or what is the impact on investors that do not do that? Well, it's a series of projects that do not move forward or are being stopped by, demonstration by communities. I mean, I'm on the road 3 weeks a month, talking with communities that I've seen in Las Bambas last month, for example, in Peru, or in other, the impact of strikes against projects that actually there obviously defer any kind of return on investment of the investment. That's why this has become really a key issue for the decision of your investments into extractive industries, and doing the right due diligence, getting with lawyers such as GRC, or with key experts on the ground such as PACT or ourselves, is really what will help you making the sound decision in investment. Sorry, Dan, I actually took a lot of your time. Can I turn to you maybe on that same question, and maybe we'll wrap it up maybe on this after. How PACT can actually bring support to investors on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Remy. Look, I think one thing I'd like to say first of all as well, because I know a lot of private sector experience or their encounters with civil society are not always very positive ones around things like modern slavery and child labour. The PACT perspective is very much, we do not see private sector or business as an ill. In fact, we see it as a good, and we understand that artisanal mining is not, it's not dealing with that. It's not a CSR activity. Working against modern slavery, and that is not, it's a core business. We're at the really sharp end of a really, really, really tough business, right? And we understand that. So everything we have to do when we talk to miners, we don't go in and talk to them about their rights. We talk to them about how they'd like to earn more money, right? How would you like to be safer, right? So for us, getting more for them from the value chain it's going all the way up the value chain as well, right? Because they're not the only ones that are going to get it. Indeed, in the mines that we work in, it's not uncommon to see yields increase by 20%. I mean, this is just basic health and safety stuff. People aren't getting injured; they're working more productively. So I think that's a really important way to see that this is not, this is not just about compliance. It's also about, sort of being big of business. And who are the sorts of people that we're looking at? Because while governments are moving towards regulation, there are firms out there who aren't waiting for that. So we have people like Trafigura, Apple, I've mentioned, Google, Microsoft, LME, right? There's a whole, and a lot of smaller ones that, kind of who are coming to us and saying, how can we deal with these issues? Because they're things we want to deal with, not just because we're being forced to because the regulator's coming. I do, however, think, we can help companies to get there before the regulator comes. And I imagine it would be a lot less expensive to sort of get to these, to kind of proof your supply chains before the regulator comes to you, right? And you also then get to influence the shape of regulatory frameworks and legislation, which can only be a boon. But what can PACT do? Look, we're on the ground. We actually, our teams are in the field, out in the middle of Congo, and you name it, wherever they're there. We have the connections. We've got, the political connections. We know the political economy. We know the geography. We know, we can get to places others can't, and we can do real due diligence on the ground, right, bottom up. But we can do that right the way up to the boardroom level as well. And we, it's great having partners like GRC with whom we share values, which I think is really important in this business, because it's not two ends of different ends of the scale. These are two ends of the same scale, right? We're connected, I think, intrinsically. So I think, yeah, that due diligence kind of expertise is critical. Political economy analysis, just understanding really what is happening. I think also, there are activities we can do, and again, this is very broad because it really depends on the mineral, it depends on the country or whatever. But there are whole programs, for example, we can set up. We can certify that a mineral is conflict-free or child labor-free from the moment it comes out of the ground to the moment it hits the smelter. Right? These are not expensive programs in the grand scheme of things. These are not expensive to do. When you start going down the sort of consumer route and stuff, that's a very different ballgame. But I mean, certainly in terms of production, where exploitation is rife, and where I think we are going to see the onus of legislation and regulation, that's where we can be, and that's where we can help. And we can work hand in hand with people like GRC to make sure that you get that kind of root and branch you know, safety, comfort for an organization that you're looking at, for example. And that can be very small investments and it can be much larger, but you know, it's there, it's available, and it's perfectly feasible. You know, we have proven examples, partners who are giving us, you know, significant amounts of money to do this for them on an ongoing basis because they see it as good business sense.
Absolutely. And we passed the hour mark, and without even realizing, that means that you were very interesting, my friends. I mean, I think what's interesting, maybe to try to wrap it up, is that this issue, as I said, is only growing, and we're going to see with the arrival of the Biden administration, with a narrow series of international regimes, much more scrutiny on these issues, building on the work that has already been done in Europe or by organizations such as the OECD or industrial organization. The methodologies to be able to monitor this, or to be able to have a series of implementation of our corrective actions do exist. The legal knowledge, I mean, especially with our friends at GRC, is very clear, leading the pack, you know, internationally in the series of regulations that are appearing in other countries. And in terms of actions, and whether it is the network that, you know, PACT has, Embellie also has in countries where PACT is less present, and also to obviously do some audits, or also some more structural solutions, such as, you know, online platform, monitoring platform that allows not only to have an audit or an assessment at time, you know, zero, but really to be able to make sure that those processes continue being implemented, both, you know, within communities and from the corporate perspective. All this is existing. The question is, you know, how you investing into this risk mitigation area, or leading the pack towards having much more sustainable sources of supply. I think all the panelists, myself, Andrew, we're here obviously to answer any question that you would have, and please reach out individually or through Andrew and myself. Our objective is to share best practices and to be able to continue into that, you know, supporting our investors, friends, or company friends, into making sure that they fulfill their obligations and do not face strong risks in the future. So without further ado, I'm just going to say maybe goodbye to everyone on behalf of everyone, to all our listeners, and please do reach out to me in the future. And thank you again, Amayele, Michele, Wayne, Andrew, and Dan, for being part of this event. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Remy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Have a wonderful day and evening to all of you guys. Okay, cheers.